So this discussion with Ben Spencer, GS8, is part of our Building Essex Supply Chain Opportunities event, being hosted at the Lion Inn at Derham on July the 1st, 2026. First off, Ben, just a bit of an introduction to GS8, if you could.
Yeah, sure. So we set up in 2014, primarily focused on delivering urban regeneration schemes to deliver homes for owner-occupiers, so primarily first-time buyers. We've gradually evolved the business over the last 12 years into becoming more of a suburban, rural, semi-rural house builder, but particularly kind of carved a niche for ourselves as, you know, we would argue the market leader in the UK for what we call regenerative housing, primarily focused around, you know, low carbon, low energy, low waste delivery.
Brilliant. And just tell us a little bit about your work you've got going on in Essex as well.
Yeah, sure. So a number of schemes coming forward in Essex across different stages at the moment. So we have a scheme in Thornwood, close to Epping, which is falls within Epping Forest, which is 113 houses and apartments. Some, I guess, unique features around that scheme include it's the first scheme globally to be able to guarantee zero energy bills through a kind of centralized microgrid, which is in partnership with Octopus. But it's also been a kind of test or pilot for us in certain respects about how we can scale what we've done at a smaller scale, really, in terms of that regenerative housing model, across kind of larger housing schemes. Successful so far. We've delivered around 44 houses. Most of them have been affordable to date, but the residents that have moved in really engaged and love living there, which is great. We've got other schemes coming forward, particularly one that we just got planning for in Basildon in April, which is 850 homes. Looking to make a start on that later this year. Follow a lot of the same principles that we're delivering across the business and in Thornwood. We have a couple other schemes coming forward in Epping Forest, in Chigwell, schemes of between 100 and 230 houses. So quite a lot in Essex at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant. That's going to be music to the ears of the Essex suppliers we've got at the event. I guess you've obviously mentioned there about the kind of regenerative model that you have around housing. How does your kind of supply chain and your kind of procurement frameworks, how do they kind of fit into that model?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, our starting point for procurement is first and foremost seeing what we can procure locally, in terms of proximity to the site, and also UK produced or sourced. Examples of that can be, we made a commitment a couple of years ago to an organisation called Grown in Britain, essentially support UK forestry industry. So sustainable timber grown in the UK, and we procure all of our timber through their accredited supply chains. Which has obviously been big commitment, but good for us from a carbon perspective in terms of localized procurement. We also try to only specify products that have EPDs. We're able to trace the kind of carbon impact, right the way back to source, including all the components where there are components that it's made from. And we have a number of criteria that before we onboard a supplier to essentially be able to provide or supply product to our developments. There's essentially like a questionnaire that includes things like how do they manage waste, how do they manage effectively power, if there's manufacturing involved, do they have take back schemes? One of the key things for us is our zero waste commitment on site. So it's really important our supply chain are aligned with us and that there's kind of transparency in terms of what happens to that waste if it is created. And so it's just a number of qualifications in the same way you might qualify a subcontractor for health and safety and competency. We're doing the same to our supply chain if they're just providing materials as well.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a few things in there I know we've spoken about where, it doesn't sometimes comply with what a traditional supply chain would look like and what traditional suppliers might look to do. And how have you kind of found those conversations that you've had with suppliers that have kind of got on your framework and are supplying you guys with all of those kind of requirements and involved?
So generally, we haven't really come up against much pushback. I think the way that we kind of work collaboratively with suppliers, they see most of what we're asking them to do as potential efficiency improvements, in terms of their operations. But also something which, a lot of our supply chain naturally are just inclined to try to be more progressive in, and that really runs from, suppliers like Wholesome, who are providing kind of concrete mixes for us, all the way to, more kind of niche suppliers like, Smile Plastics, who, provide kind of wet area panels for us made from recycled plastics, and everything in between. So, we're also starting to see, which is really nice, traditional suppliers, particularly, in the window and like glazing spaces where they may not have EPDs at the moment, or, they may not have kind of EPDs that are to a granularity, or, kind of specified to the way that we need them actually assessed. Spending money and actually going and, investing in, getting those and getting them to the level of detail that we require, so that they're able to supply to us. And I think once we've gone through that process, we've seen a lot of our suppliers have really wanted to kind of shout about the process they've gone through and the improvements they've made, and, kind of seen a positive impact to their businesses as a result.
I mean, there's a huge value to that, isn't there? I think, it's mutual. You guys see the value from the minimizing waste on site, having really good relationships with those suppliers. And again, as you mentioned there, the suppliers kind of being in that more innovative space and kind of having approaches that make them stand out. I mean, is that something, does that translate to cost savings as well? Do you see that with obviously how you design really lean, very efficiently? Does that kind of minimization of waste on top kind of bring cost savings for you as a developer, but for suppliers as well who aren't having to oversupply you guys?
Yeah, I mean, look, our house types have been designed, with our supply chain in mind. So, we know what, size boards and timbers and whatever else, we can buy, and the dimensions that we can buy them. And so that's how we've set out, wherever possible, the dimensions of our houses. So, subsequently, that's one of the ways that we're able to drive down waste in the first instance on site. I think in terms of, our own costs, by not having to have any, skips on site, there's obviously a significant saving there, and that comes through this, kind of supply chain partnerships and the way that we set up the sites and the relationships with them. And, I think at the start, there's always a bit of teething and like umming and ahhing from suppliers, because fundamentally they're going to be taking back where there is, offcuts, albeit limited. It's an additional logistical consideration that they need to make. But, I think fundamentally, so many of the big suppliers now do have take back schemes anyway, that this is becoming more and more common. I think the one that is abnormal is around kind of packaging. And so, that's something we've worked really hard on over the last 12 months, particularly to try to drive down the amount of single-use packaging that we have from our supply chain. And, because previously, when we had single-use packaging from suppliers, it would limit the amount, who we could actually procure from. And so we have seen, a huge change in, I would say, the majority of our supply chain, if not all of it, where, we're able to deliver to site, being able to use either packaging that's able to be reused or no packaging at all, particularly for, more robust materials. And, now we really just narrowed it down to the ones that are more challenging, where you have like, electrical appliances and things like that, which is, what we're currently working through with our current supply chain. But I think the consistency is key, because, if you're using different suppliers site to site, that can be quite challenging to establish those relationships. When you have a core supply chain, that really does make it a lot easier, because, they've got the comfort that you're always going to order from them. We've got the comfort that they know what we expect, and, just kind of build that trust and that, system over the years.
You've mentioned obviously there's a few sites you've got coming forward in Essex. What kind of keeps you coming back? What's got you kind of invested in Essex and in the region?
I think beyond the fact that that's where I grew up, it's, it's incredibly well connected borough. You look at, all of the kind of major towns and, even some of the villages, across the borough, they have great connections into particularly London, but also the rest of the country. We based our construction business there for a reason, and that's not necessarily the reason why we're developing there, but a lot of the same characteristics or like considerations that we made to base that business there are the same reasons that we like to build houses there. Like I said, connectivity, access to nature, some of the best access to nature in the country, arguably, with particularly Epping Forest. Obviously in terms of trade, you've got coastline in Essex, which obviously promotes a lot of jobs, so that's also a consideration for us. And I don't know, it's really just an area that we've established ourselves in since really the day that we started. And there is, I believe, a huge amount of opportunity in Essex. There is a lot of really good local authorities that you can work with that are proactive, and actually want to see housing come forward, and are willing to kind of think out the box and work with developers. So and obviously Essex County Council, as they currently exist, we've had a long-standing relationship with, and have been really progressive over how many decades, from like design guides that are published, from kind of net zero strategies to plenty of other kind of policies that really do push developers to try and deliver the best schemes possible. And that for us is an area that one of the reasons why we really enjoy working in the county. So
no, that's excellent. It's exactly what we want to hear from one of our developers that are going to be here for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, keep going, amount of years. So it's brilliant. So, well, yeah, thanks very much for all your time, Ben, today. So just to recap, that was Building Essex Supply Chain Opportunities conversation with Ben Spencer at GS8. Cheers, Ben.
Oh, thanks, mate.